Hello, I'm Father Anthony Cekada. Welcome to broadcast number 8 for the Philothea Press bestseller, Work of Human Hands, a theological critique of the Mass of Paul VI by the Reverend Anthony Cekada. To order Work of Human Hands and to read excerpts, visit www.philotheapress.com. Chapter 8, Introductory Rites, Meeting and Greeting. When I began researching this book in the 1980s, I decided to observe how Sunday Masses were celebrated at different churches in Rochester, New York. One Mass was particularly memorable. After the entrance song, which was accompanied by guitars and percussion, the priest greeted the congregation with a cheery good morning, to which they all responded, "Good morning, Father Chuck." Father Chuck took the wireless microphone and began wandering up and down the aisle, talking, joking, and inviting comments from members of the gathered assembly. The high point, or perhaps the low point, came when Father Chuck spotted me in the back and had the assembly give me a round of applause. If we were to visit Father Chuck's church these days, we can pretty much imagine that he'd be beginning his Mass just about the same way he did 30 years ago. But we might also encounter his young assistant, Father Retro, clad in a high-collared cassock from Gamarelli, the papal tailors. Father Retro, part of the JP2 generation of priests, might confide he doesn't care for Father Chuck's loosey-goosey, warm and fuzzy liturgical style. "When I offer Mass," he might tell you, "it's just the way Paul VI wanted it, strictly by the book. Do the red, say the black, the rite of EWTN. What's more, Father Retro might even tell you that he's just about to celebrate the old Latin Mass, the extraordinary form, he calls it, in a side chapel. This would be a great opportunity to compare the old rite and the new rite. If we were to watch both simultaneously, Father Retro's Latin Mass in the side chapel and Father Chuck's version of the Mass of Paul VI at the main altar, what differences would we notice? The first would be the opposite directions in which the priests conduct the respective rites. In the old rite, the priest faces the altar, symbolically towards God. In the new rite, he faces the people, symbolically towards man, a change from what we saw Father Patino call a theocentric or God-centered orientation to an anthropocentric or man-centered orientation. Not only is the physical direction of the rites different, but their structure and purpose as well. The prayers and rites that begin the traditional Mass are directed towards priestly purification, the prayers at the foot of the altar, for instance, and the praise or supplication of God, the introit, the Kyrie, the Gloria, and the Collect. In the Mass of Paul VI, other purposes have been substituted. The general instruction says the purpose of the introductory rites is to ensure that the assembled faithful establish communion and dispose themselves for what follows. Note the typical modernist expression, establish communion. Here again, we see modernist assembly theology at work through the inflation of language. Another type of communion is created in order to devalue the communion of the Mass. Other liturgists picked up on these ideas and relentlessly promoted them. And Father Patino, a member of Concilium Study Group 10 who worked directly on creating the new order of Mass, said the purpose of the introductory rites is to stir up a sense of community, to arouse enthusiasm, to foster unanimity, to enliven faith in the Lord's presence among the assembly. These are goals for pep rallies or group therapy, not the opening rites of the Mass. But with the introductory rites of the Mass of Paul VI, we have stumbled into another religious universe, and it's a long way from the foot of the altar. The first element in the introductory rites is the entrance song. This is supposed to intensify the unity of the gathered people. More assembly theology, of course. The entrance song replaced what in the Old Mass is called the introit. For the introit, you were required to use the text given in the missal. The entrance song, on the other hand, is a typical example of liturgical deregulation. The general instruction offers various options. In practice, when the new Mass is celebrated, the liturgy planner decides what the text for the entrance song will say, what musical style will be used, and what instruments will accompany the song. What will intensify the unity of this particular assembly. So it can be a schola singing a Latin chant, a more contemporary sound, a young lady leading on eagle's wings, something from the monastic tradition, a hymn accompanied by a mighty organ, or even a polka entrance song, Roll Out the Barrel. In the deregulated liturgy of Paul VI, Father Retro can choose old-fashioned Catholic options, and Father Chuck can rock or even polka on to his warm and fuzzy heart's content. When I was a seminarian after Vatican II and planning liturgies as a church musician, I was certainly in the Father Retro camp. As far as I was concerned, the more traditional options you could heap onto a celebration of the new Mass, the better. But I eventually realized that the new norms governing how the Mass of Paul VI can be celebrated allow a broad spectrum of options for countless features of the rite. It all fits in on what we could call the Chuck Retro liturgical scale. What you choose is entirely permitted under the new rules, and it's mostly just a matter of taste. Where does your parish fit in? Next, we turn to the greeting. The old Mass, one liturgist complained, began almost brutally. The Mass began from cold. So, the new Mass would have a greeting to make it warmer and more people-friendly. For a historical precedent, liturgists cited a short remark by St. Augustine about how he began Mass. Salutavi populum, I greeted the people. Perhaps they imagine the saint as the 4th century North African Father Chuck. By means of the greeting, says the general instruction, the priest signifies the presence of the Lord to the assembled community. So, a whole new theology grew up around the greeting. Bugnini's assistant, Father Carlo Braga, said the greeting begins dialogue between the priest and the people, fosters their communion, signals the nature of the gathering, in whose midst is present Christ himself. The presence of Christ among those gathered in his name is declared. And here we see once again, chugging along at full steam, modernist assembly theology, which corrupts theological concepts by corrupting language. According to Braga, dialogue, a merely natural act, brings about communion, a word normally applied only to the Holy Eucharist. This communion indicates the nature of the gathering, in whose midst Christ himself is present. So, with the greeting, we are back to the Bouillet Briliot modernist ecumenical theology of other real presences. These were invented to devalue the real presence. Other liturgists followed the lead given by the men who created the new Mass. The purpose of the greeting, said Father Johannes Emminghaus, is to help form a human community, oriented toward the presence of the Lord in his assembled community. Even the way the priest extends his hands to greet the congregation is important. It should look like an invitation or an embrace, not be excessively restrained and ritualistic, but be marked by ease and affability. After the greeting, the general instruction says that the priest, deacon, or a lay minister may introduce the faithful to the Mass of the day with a few words. Vatican II itself specifically prescribed that the Reformed liturgy allow for such comments. Father Peter Coughlin, another one of Bugnini's assistants in Concilium, called this an opportunity which allows the celebrant to fill out the greeting in a more spontaneous and informal way. Other liturgists followed suit. You can go beyond the official greeting to a more personal one. The exhortation, apart from its psychological appropriateness, can also be seen as a communication of the Spirit to the community. It can establish good rapport between the priest and people by a strong horizontal awareness of the assembled people. What we have said so far in this broadcast should be enough to indicate the profound theological shift behind the changes in the introductory rites. Priestly purification and protestations of unworthiness have given way to stirring up a sense of community, dialogue, affability, forming a human community, building rapport, and acknowledging Christ's presence in the people. So while a young conservative like Father Retro may think that the Mass of Paul VI calls for a 1940s liturgical style as buttoned up as his Gammarelli cassock, it's actually the old loosey-goosey Father Chucks who had the theology of the new rite figured out all along. It's all about the assembly. The men who created the new Mass told us so. Which is why all Father Chucks and all Father Retros should read Meeting and Greeting, Chapter 8 of Work of Human Hands, a theological critique of the Mass of Paul VI. Our next chapter, the Revised Orations, New Values, New Perspectives. But please, Father Chuck, hold the applause. To order Work of Human Hands and to read excerpts, visit www.philotheapress.com.